If someone harms you, why can't you just, well, hit them back?
Right. It sounds like a childish question.
Yeah, it sounds like a simple, maybe even childish question, but it's actually the foundation of every law we live by today. We're diving into a stack of historical research for this exploration into the source material. We want to track the evolution of justice.
Exactly. We're looking at how punishment transformed from a raw, primal instinct into a calculated tool of the state.
And it's a wild ride. We go from primal family feuds all the way to the complex court systems we have now.
It really is quite a journey. The sources break this down into 4 distinct eras. We start with the era of blood feuds, move through the divine laws of the ancient East, then see the rise of political law in Greece and Rome,
and finally land in what they call the loss of peace during the Middle Ages. Let's actually start with that primal instinct.
The sources describe early justice as purely reactive.
You wrong my family, we seek vengeance.
Right. It was a vicious cycle of blood feuds, but then we get to the famous lex talionis.
The eye for an eye.
Exactly. And to us, taking someone's eye out sounds like the definition of barbaric.
So how is that an improvement?
It's really all about the ceiling. Before lex talionis, if you broke my tooth, my family might just decide to wipe out your entire household in retaliation.
Yeah.
There was absolutely no limit.
Oh, wow. So this law actually mitigated the violence.
It did. It said, no, you only get the tooth. It was the first time society tried to match the punishment to the injury. It stopped those endless cycles of escalation.
So it wasn't about being cruel. It was about being proportional.
A massive leap toward restraint.
That's a heavy shift.
Yeah.
But then the motivation changes again. The sources show us that in places like ancient Israel, India, and Persia, crime stopped being just a personal matter.
Yes, we enter the era of divine vengeance. In these societies, a crime wasn't just a wrong against a neighbor, it was a sin against God.
Which means the whole community is suddenly at risk.
Precisely. The community risked divine anger unless they performed expiation, a punishment meant to placate the heavens. Take the Code of Manu in India.
The king is basically a delegate of divinity there, right?
Right. So if you break the law, you aren't just answering to a man, you are answering to the universe.
That is incredibly high stakes for the individual. If your neighbor steals, you're worried God is going to punish the whole village. But there was a weird outlier during this time.
Hammurabi.
Code of Hammurabi, yeah.
He is the great exception. While everyone else was looking at the stars, Hammurabi was looking at the ground. His code was largely secularized.
It focused on social order instead of sin.
And it even started making a distinction we take for granted today, the difference between a voluntary act and an accident.
Which feels like the perfect bridge to the Greeks. They seem to be the ones who really obsessed over that distinction of will.
They did. Greece shifted the focus from the sacrificial to the political. They began asking, did you mean to throw that spear, or did it just slip?
By separating evil intent from mere negligence, they moved law toward a moral and civil foundation. So if Greece gave us the intent, how did Rome turn that into a giant machine? Because it feels like the Romans were less about morality and more about management.
You've hit it perfectly. For Rome, the absolute principle was the preservation of the state. They completely stripped religion away from the courtroom.
And their big moment was the 12 tables.
In the 5th century BC, yes. It's essentially the first great monument of human penal law. They created a clear divide between crimina publica,
Crimes against the collective interest, like treason.
right, and delicta privata, which were injuries to specific people. It was the state taking charge of the public peace.
But history isn't a straight line toward progress. Once the Roman Empire faded, we see return to these unwritten Germanic customs in the Middle Ages.
This is a fascinating moment. Your safety wasn't guaranteed by a police force back then. It was guaranteed by your status.
This is where peace becomes almost a ethical thing you could lose.
Yes. If you committed a crime, you were declared friedlos. You suffered Friedlosigkeit, or the loss of peace.
So if I'm living in a Germanic tribe and I lose my peace, does that mean anyone can just...
Take you out.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You were an outlaw. Legally, you didn't exist anymore, which meant you had zero protection.
So you're essentially a legal ghost. It's a psychological and social death sentence.
It really shows a move toward valuing the individual's role within the community's peace.
When you look at all this together, you can clearly see the 4-stage transformation. Private vengeance, driven by instinct. Divine vengeance, driven by religion. Public vengeance, driven by the state.
And finally, where we are now, the humanitarian period.
Which is supposed to be about reform and prevention.
Supposed to be. But as the scholar George Kirchway noted in our sources, law is a growth out of custom and instinct. It's not something that just appeared out of nowhere.
It's a living thing that still carries the DNA of its past.
Exactly.
To sum it up for you listening, our modern justice system isn't just a set of dry rules. It's a reflection of thousands of years of human nature trying to figure out how to live together without killing each other.
We've moved from instinct to reason, at least on paper.
Right. So we'll leave you with this to mull over. If the history of law is a slow climb from instinct to reason, which part of our modern legal system still feels secretly rooted in that ancient primal instinct for vengeance rather than actual reform? Think about that next time you see a headline. Thanks for joining this exploration into the source material.
Welcome to The Explainer. You know, we love taking big, complicated topics and breaking them down. And today we're tackling a huge one, the history of penal law. We're going to find out where our ideas of crime and punishment actually come from. All right, let's just jump right in with a really big question, something that gets to the very heart of our legal system. Where do you draw the line between justice and revenge? Think about it. That single question has been shaping law for, well, thousands of years. And to even begin to answer that, we've got to do what the legal historian George Kirchway suggested. We need to go way, way back, all the way back to the very beginnings of human history to find the roots of our modern laws. So, let's do it. Let's dig in and see how our entire system of punishment came to be, starting right at the dawn of human society.
Okay, so when historians look at how law develops, they kind of see two main paths. One is that law changes in these big, sudden, revolutionary leaps. The other view is that it's more of a slow, gradual evolution over time. Now, there's truth to both, for sure. But for our story, the story of punishment, it makes the most sense to follow that slow, evolutionary path one step at a time.
So picture this. Our story starts in a time with no countries, no courts, no police. None of that existed. It was an era run by one thing, really. A single, powerful, and very, very personal instinct. You know, back in these super early societies, there was no government to call if someone wronged you. Justice wasn't something the public handled. It was on you. The only way to deal with a crime was through private vengeance, what's called venganza privata. And if you think about it, this was basically the very first human law. And here's the really wild part. The rest of society, they didn't care. They were totally indifferent. A crime wasn't seen as an offense against the community or the people. Nope. It was a purely personal beef between you and the person who wronged you, or, more likely, between your family and theirs.
Yeah, as you can probably guess, this whole system of private revenge had let's say, a massive flaw. It would just spiral out of control into these devastating, multi-generational wars we call blood feuds. Somebody gets hurt, so their family retaliates. Then the other family counter-retaliates. And this vicious cycle would just keep going, sometimes until entire families were literally wiped off the map.
So obviously, this couldn't last. The extraordinary evils of the blood feud, that's what historians call them, it was just completely unsustainable. Early societies, they had to come up with something new. They were forced to innovate, to figure out a way to stop this endless cycle of violence. And the first big idea they came up with to put the brakes on all this violence is a concept you've definitely heard of. It's called lex talionis, the law of retaliation. Right, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We've all heard that. And to us, today, it sounds so barbaric, right? But here's the twist. Its original purpose was the exact opposite. It was actually revolutionary. This is what's so cool. An eye for an eye wasn't a command to get revenge. It was a rule to limit revenge. It meant you could take an eye for an eye, but that's it. No more. You couldn't kill someone for poking you in the eye. This was like the world's very first legal limit, a cap on punishment. It was a huge step away from chaos and towards organized justice. Okay, so what came next? The next step in this whole evolution was another honestly brilliant idea, the system of settlement, also known as composition. This was a real game changer. It basically meant that instead of violence, justice could be bought. Instead of taking that eye for an eye, the victim's side could just accept a payment. Money, livestock, whatever, to call it even. A financial settlement could now replace physical revenge. This was yet another step toward taming that raw instinct for violence. But here's the thing. This neat, tidy progression from pure revenge to limited retaliation to paying someone off, that wasn't the only way it happened. History has a fascinating outlier, a real plot twist. I'm talking about the legal system we see in ancient cuneiform laws from places like Babylonia. Their system, it kind of broke the mold. It really is a fascinating twist in our story. See, what they had was a totally different model. In places like ancient Babylonia, criminal law was a matter for the state, like right from the get-go. It's almost like they skipped the whole private vengeance phase. Now, punishment was still carried out for the victim, and yeah, you could still pay a fine to get out of it. But the key difference is, the state was the one in charge, the one calling the shots. For its time, this was an incredibly advanced system. So let's bring it all back. What does this long, winding journey from bloody feuds all the way to the first state-run legal systems tell us about how we think about justice today? Well, we've seen this really clear path unfold, right? It started with pure chaos, unlimited, destructive personal revenge. Then, society put a cap on it with lex talionis. After that, we got the option to just pay up instead, with financial settlements. And finally, for most cultures, this all grew into a system where justice became the job of a central authority, of the state. The key takeaway here is that every single one of these steps was a solution to the problem that came before it. It was all about humanity trying to tame one of our oldest, most powerful instincts, vengeance. And all these attempts, layered on top of each other over centuries, slowly built the legal structures we live with today. You could almost say our entire justice system is a giant monument to that long, hard effort. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. After all this evolution, with all our sophisticated laws, our formal courts, our whole prison system, how much of that ancient, primal instinct for revenge is still hiding inside our modern ideas of justice? It's something worth thinking about, isn't it?
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, I want you to start by just closing your eyes for a second. Try to imagine this scenario. It is, let's say 5,000 years ago. You're standing in a dry, dusty field. You look down and you see your brother lying on the ground. He's not moving.
Right.
Someone from the neighboring tribe, maybe a guy you've seen down at the river, has just killed him.
Yeah.
There is no police force to call. There are no judges. There isn't even a concept of a jail or, a lawsuit. The only thing that exists in the entire world, right in that exact moment, is the absolute rage burning in your chest. What do you do?
Well, if you are like 99% of humans throughout history, you don't just get mad, you get even.
Yeah.
And you probably don't stop at the person who did it either. You go after his brother, his father, his cattle, his entire bloodline.
It is a terrifying image, honestly. But today we are stripping away the marble columns, the wigs, the polished wood, and the gavels of the modern court system. We are going right back to that exact moment in the dirt field.
We have to. If we want to understand the bedrock of why we have laws in the first place, we have to start there. And frankly, it's a little frightening.
It really is. It's a journey that takes us from the cave to the temple and finally to the state. We're doing a deep dive today into a really fascinating document titled The History of Penal Law by Lorenzo U. Padilla.
Yes, and it's worth noting that Padilla synthesizes work from some absolute heavy hitters in historical legal scholarship here. People like Kirchway, Coelho Colon, and Puig Pena.
And I want to be super clear right off the bat to you listening at home. This isn't just going to be a list of dates and dusty statutes. We're not doing that. This is an exploration of human instinct, specifically the instinct of vengeance.
Exactly. Because long before we had penal law, before we had civilization as we currently understand it, we had vengeance. La venganza.
Right.
And understanding how we moved away from that, or at least how we tried to move away from that, is essentially the story of the human species trying to tame itself.
It's kind of the ultimate what if, right? If someone hurts you, really hurts you, what is your actual first instinct?
Yeah.
It's not to file a motion for discovery.
No, absolutely not.
It's to hurt them back.
Yeah.
That's the primal baseline.
It is. And what Padilla does so well in this text is he traces the evolutionary perspective of criminal justice.
So let's unpack that term first, the evolutionary perspective. Because usually when we talk about big historical changes, we talk about revolutions, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution.
Right. And historians generally do look at legal history in two distinct ways. You have the revolutionary view, which is often tied to thinkers like Marx or Hegel.
Okay.
That view sees change as sudden, cataclysmic even. It's almost like an explosion that destroys the old world entirely just to build a new one from the ashes.
Evolution by revolution. You just burn it all down to build it up.
Precisely. But the source we're looking at today leans into the evolutionary view. This suggests that law develops in gradual, almost imperceptible increments. It's not a sudden explosion, it's a slow growth, like a tree slowly adding rings over centuries.
Gotcha.
And this whole idea relies on a really fascinating concept called the psychic unity of mankind.
Okay, I love that phrase, but I have to stop you there. Psychic unity. It sounds like we're all part of some sci-fi hive mind. Are we saying ancient humans were telepathic?
No telepathy involved at all. It's an anthropological theory. Think of it this way. If you took a human brain and drop it into the deep forests of ancient Germany, and you take another human brain and drop it in the jungles of the Amazon, those two brains are running the exact same operating system.
Same hardware, just a completely different environment.
Exactly. So when those two totally separated groups face the exact same problem, whether that's theft or murder or a land dispute, they tend to come up with the exact same solution, even if they never interact or speak to each other.
Oh, that makes sense. That explains why we see pyramids in Egypt and also pyramids in Mexico.
That is the architectural version of it, yes. In legal terms, this creates what Padilla calls parallelism. Different cultures go through the exact same legal stages, just at different times in their history.
They hit the same milestones.
Right. They all start with vengeance, then they all move to religious expiation, then they all eventually end up with state-sanctioned punishment. It's not because they copied each other's homework, it's because that's simply how the human-animal processes conflict.
So the guy in ancient China and the guy in ancient Rome are both dealing with someone stealing their grain, and their brains just inherently drift toward the exact same legal solution.
That's the theory. But, and here is a very important cautionary note from the source, it's not a perfectly straight line. We have to talk about survivals.
Survivals, like survival of the fittest.
More like leftovers. The source explicitly compares old laws to animals living in an environment that just hasn't changed. Just because a society evolves legally doesn't mean the old laws completely disappear. They hang around.
Like ghosts in the machine.
Yes. You might have a very modern, very sophisticated court system that still has a tiny piece of primitive vengeance stuck right in the middle of it, like a fossil.
Or kind of like how we still say dial a phone even though there's no physical dial anymore. Or shaking hands to show we aren't holding a weapon.
Exactly. Those are social survivals. But in law, it's often much darker. It explains why, even in a highly civilized society today, when we hear on the news about a really horrific crime, a primal part of us genuinely wants to see the criminals suffer physically.
Yeah, that visceral reaction.
That is the survival of the vengeance instinct just peeking right through the modern suit and tie.
That makes total sense. And there's another disclaimer Padilla makes right at the beginning too, right?
Yeah.
About the difference between what's written down on paper and what actually happened in reality.
Yes, this is crucial for anyone studying history. Just because something was written down in a holy book or carved into a stone tablet doesn't mean people actually did it.
Right, like the source mentions those old Jewish laws about freeing slaves.
The written law in that context said you had to free Jewish slaves after 6 years of service. It was very clear on the page. But the historical records strongly suggest that people often just didn't do it. They completely ignored it.
They found loopholes or just refused.
Exactly. So we have to be really careful as we look at this history, not to mistake the law on the books for the law on the street. They are often two very different things.
Okay, so with those warnings firmly in mind, let's go back to that field. Let's go back to the body of the brother. We are entering part 1 of our deep dive, the era of private vengeance, or as the source officially calls it, primitive law.
We are in a time before the state even exists. There is no 911 to call, there is no town watch to flag down, there is literally only you, your family, and your tribe.
And if someone from tribe A kills someone from tribe B, what actually happens? Like, walk us through the mechanics of how that plays out.
Total unmitigated chaos. This is the era of the blood feud. Sangrientas guerras privadas. Bloody private wars. And war really is the right word here, because in this primitive mindset, justice isn't about the individual at all.
It's broader than that.
Much broader. If you kill my brother, I don't just blame you. I blame your brother, your father, your son, your cousin. Your entire group is completely guilty in my eyes.
So it's pure collective responsibility.
And because I blame your whole group, my whole group is going to attack your whole group. And then, of course, your group has to retaliate against my group to regain their lost honor and balance the scales. It becomes this endless, brutal cycle of slaughter.
It sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
And honestly, just biologically unsustainable. If everyone keeps killing everyone's families over every slight, eventually there's no one left to hunt or farm or gather.
That is exactly the practical problem they ran into. Pure vengeance creates extraordinary evils. It literally threatens the existence of the species.
Right.
Think about it. If you wipe out the neighboring tribe, who do you trade with when winter comes? Who do your children marry to avoid inbreeding?
Right, you're just isolating yourself into extinction.
Exactly. Humanity was facing a genuine crisis. They had to come up with a solution, a way to somehow put the brakes on this endless violence.
And this leads us to one of the most famous, and I think probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of human history, the lex talionis.
The law of Talion.
An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now, I have to be totally honest. When we hear that phrase today, we usually think of it as completely barbaric. We think, oh, that's so cruel and backwards. It sounds like something a mob boss says before he whacks someone in a movie.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and where the evolutionary perspective is so key. Historically speaking, the lex talionis was a massive humanitarian leap forward.
Okay, you have to explain that. How on earth is legally gouging someone's eye out a humanitarian leap?
You have to think about what came right before it. Before the Talion, if you knocked out my tooth, I might decide to cut off your head. Then I might burn down your house. Then I might kill your livestock and your children. There was absolutely no limit. The exchange rate on violence was infinite.
Ah, I see. So it wasn't about mandating cruelty. It wasn't saying you must be cruel.
No, the lex talionis introduces the concept of strict proportionality. It says, you can take an eye, but you can only take an eye. You cannot take their life. You cannot take their whole head. It put a hard ceiling on vengeance.
So it was actually a restriction, a regulation on human rage.
Exactly. It effectively stopped the blood feud in its tracks. It said, once you take the eye, the debt is paid in full. It's over. No more fighting, no more generational wars. It allowed society to stabilize. It was basically the first time we ever applied math to justice. 1 for 1, no more, no less.
That completely flips the script on how I usually think about that phrase. But the source says we didn't just stop there, because frankly, even taking an eye is pretty messy. And if you blind me and I blind you, now the tribe just has 2 blind people who can't hunt or farm.
Right, it's just bad economics.
Yeah.
A tribe with a bunch of one-eyed, one-handed people is going to get immediately conquered by the fully limbed tribe next door. So the next logical step in this legal evolution is composition, or settlement.
And this is basically the invention of the fine.
It is. The offender pays the victim or the victim's family to avoid the physical retaliation entirely. Instead of me taking your eye, you give me 5 goats.
I would take the goats every single time.
Most people would, and this is the direct ancestor of our modern system of damages and civil settlements. It transformed blood into gold. It took the physical anger and converted it into tangible economic value.
But wait, the source mentions those survivals here too. Did private vengeance really just disappear overnight once we started paying each other in goats?
Not at all. The source points out that self-help autoayuda survived for a very, very long time. For example, in Germanic law, there was something called the hue and cry.
The hue and cry, it sounds like an indie band name.
It was essentially a community alarm system. If you caught a thief in the act, you were legally allowed to raise the hue and cry. You scream, you bang pots, whatever it takes. And the entire community would chase the person down and deal with them right there on the spot.
Wow. So just sanctioned vigilante justice.
Completely sanctioned. Or look at Rome. For a long time, they threw certain offenders off the Turpian Rock. That wasn't necessarily a bureaucratic state execution in the modern sense. It was a highly ritualized form of community vengeance. So the primal instinct to just do it yourself lingered long, long after the laws were officially written down.
It's amazing how deeply ingrained that instinct is. But as society starts getting more complicated, as populations grow, we move into part 2 of our outline, the era of divine vengeance.
This is a massive shift. We are officially moving from the cave to the temple. Society is organizing. You start to see chiefs and kings emerging. And where do these kings inevitably claim they get their right to rule?
Usually straight from the gods.
Right. So the very nature of crime changes completely. In the primitive era, if I hit you, I hurt you. It's a personal injury case between you and me. But in the era of divine vengeance, if I hit you, I am personally offending God.
Because God made the rules. So I've basically polluted the spiritual atmosphere of the whole town.
Yes. The entire goal of punishment shifts. It's no longer just about satisfying the victim's family with goats. It's about expiation. We absolutely have to calm the anger of the deity. Placatio. Because if God is angry, he won't just punish the criminal. He'll send a flood. He'll send a devastating drought. He'll punish the entire community.
That raises the stakes incredibly high. Suddenly, it's not just, hey, I want my goats back. It's, hey, we need to kill this guy right now so the sun actually comes up tomorrow.
Precisely. The community suddenly has a desperate, terrifying interest in punishment. Let's look at the first case study the source provides. Israel and Mosaic law. The Pentateuch.
Right, the first 5 books of the Old Testament.
Here, crime is explicitly defined as sin. The judges aren't just civil servants reading a code, they are acting directly in God's name. And initially, we still see that primitive collective responsibility we talked about earlier. If you sinned, your whole family suffered the wrath.
But that did change over time, right? The source mentions a shift.
It did. The Book of Deuteronomy eventually introduced the revolutionary idea that fathers shouldn't be put to death for the sins of their sons, nor sons for the sins of their fathers. We finally start to see the individual emerging from the shadow of the collective group. But my absolute favorite example of a survival in Mosaic law, and Padilla goes into great detail on this, is the city of refuge.
Oh, I read about this in the source. This is so fascinating. It genuinely feels like a movie script. Break it down for everyone listening.
Okay, so remember the Avenger of Blood. In the primitive blood feud, the victim's closest relative had a sacred duty to hunt down and kill the killer. That's the Avenger. Now, Mosaic law kept that figure. They didn't ban the Avenger of Blood outright, but they created a brilliant legal loophole, a kind of zoning law for vengeance.
Okay, so set the scene for us. Let's say I've killed someone accidentally. Maybe I was chopping wood and the axe head just flew off the handle and hit somebody.
The Avenger is still coming for you.
Yeah.
And legally, he is allowed to kill you. You have to run. But there are 6 specially designated cities of refuge scattered throughout Israel. If you can physically make it to the gates of one of those specific cities before the Avenger catches you, you are completely safe.
It's literally like reaching base in a game of tag.
Exactly like that.
Right.
If you cross that threshold, the high priest takes you in, the Avenger has to stop right at the gate. He can stand there, he can stare at you, he can hate you all he wants, but he absolutely cannot touch you. You are officially under God's protection.
That is such a clever legislative hack. It's like the leaders realized we can't ban vengeance because the cultural instinct is just too strong, so we will just create a geographical timeout zone.
Zoning vengeance. That's a really perfect way to put it. It shows exactly how the law was trying to carefully bridge the gap between the old, chaotic bloodlust and a new, more orderly, temple-run society. Now, if we look east, the source also spends quite a bit of time on China.
Right, the Book of 5 Penalties.
China is a fascinating contrast because, unlike Israel, the religious aspect there wasn't really about a personal, emotional God like Yahweh. It was much more about maintaining a strict cosmic order. The ancient Chinese system was incredibly obsessed with the number 5.
Right, the 5 planets, 5 metals, 5 sounds.
And, inevitably, the 5 punishments. Padilla notes that Chinese law was deeply bureaucratic, but also deeply philosophical. They believed in a universal, harmonious, natural order. If you committed a crime, you didn't just break a rule, you disrupted the actual harmony of the universe.
But the punishments to fix that harmony were, they were intense. We aren't talking about handing over a few goats here.
No, not at all. The 5 punishments were standard across the board, and they were brutal. You had tattooing, which meant permanently inking a criminal's face, then cutting off the nose, cutting off the feet, castration, and finally, death.
Wow. So it's just systematic, state-run mutilation.
It was. And again, notice the survival of collective responsibility here. In China, punishment often extended to your relatives and, fascinatingly, even to the local government officials who failed to prevent your crime in the first place. The source points out that even well into the 19th century, China hadn't fully developed a system of private law. Everything was a matter of public penal regulation because absolutely everything you did affected that fragile cosmic order.
It's a very intense top-down view of the will. Basically, you messed up the universe, so we are going to permanently mess up your face to balance the scales. What about India? The source mentions the Code of Manu next.
Right, dating way back to the 11th century BC. This system is strictly religious. The king is essentially a direct delegate of divinity. But here's the truly unique feature. The Code of Manu did not use the lex talionis at all.
Wait, really? No eye for an eye?
No. Instead, it focused entirely on the caste system. The severity of the punishment depended completely on who you were and who you hurt. If a Brahmin, a high caste priest, hurt a lower caste person, the penalty was incredibly light. Maybe just a ritual spiritual cleansing or a very small fine. But if a lower caste person hurt a Brahmin, well, the punishment was absolutely horrific.
So justice wasn't blind in the slightest. It was hyper-aware of social status. It was looking right at you and judging your worth before it issued a sentence.
Exactly. It was justice completely defined by religious hierarchy. Inequality wasn't a flaw in the system. It was actively written into the very source code of the law.
Now, we have to talk about the big exception here. Padilla makes a really big deal out of this in the text. Mesopotamia, specifically the Code of Hammurabi.
Ah, Hammurabi. This is the great anomaly of the ancient world.
Why is it an anomaly? I mean, it's super old, right? Isn't it just more primitive law?
It is ancient, yes. But if you actually read the text of the code, it is shockingly secular for its time. It doesn't talk about calming the anger of the gods nearly as much as it talks about the raw authority of the state. Hammurabi wasn't waiting for a high priest to tell him what the gods wanted. He was the king, and he was laying down the law himself.
So it was just completely ahead of its time.
In a structural way, yes. It almost entirely replaced private vengeance with state-mandated punishment. The state was the sole entity handing out the penalties. But, and here is the massive kicker, and this is where modern people get really tripped up, it took the lex talionis to the absolute terrifying extreme.
How so? Like more than an eye for an eye.
It was incredibly literal, and it applied what we call vicarious punishment.
Okay, you have to give us the famous example from the source, the one about the builder.
This is the classic textbook case in Hammurabi's code. If a builder constructs a house for someone, and the house is flimsy and the roof collapses.
And it kills the homeowner.
Right. Then the builder is put to death. Now that makes sense to us, mostly. We'd call it gross negligence resulting in manslaughter. The punishment fits the crime. But what if the house collapses and it doesn't kill the homeowner? What if it kills the homeowner's son?
Well, modern logic would say you still punish the builder. Maybe harder, maybe throw him in prison for life.
Hammurabi's logic said something very different. It said, a son for a son. The law strictly demanded that the builder's son be put to death.
That is just, it's horrifying. The builder's son didn't lay a single brick. He is completely innocent.
In our modern individualistic eyes, yes, absolutely. But to Hammurabi, the value that was lost by the homeowner was a son, so the payment exacted by the state must be a son. It wasn't about moral guilt or intent at all. It was purely about balancing the mathematical ledger of the state. It treats human beings like literal currency. You lost a coin, so I will give you a coin of equal value.
It's a brutal, cold, mathematical kind of fairness. But notice, it's not a chaotic blood feud. The victim's family isn't running wild in the streets with axes. The state is coldly calculating the exact debt and exacting it systematically.
Exactly. It's that statist approach appearing very, very early in human history. Cold, calculated, and terrifyingly fair in its own twisted, bureaucratic way.
Okay, so we have the deeply religious East, and then we have this bizarre secular anomaly in Mesopotamia. But the outline says the real lasting bridge to the modern world happens when we move west, when we get to Greece.
Right. Part 3, the Greek transition. The source explicitly calls this the threshold.
Because we are officially moving from the religious East to the political West.
Yes. And the Greco-Egyptian medium is the bridge. But we have to be very careful here. As Padilla says, there was no single unified thing called Greek law. It was a complete patchwork. The law in Sparta was completely fundamentally different from the law in Athens.
Let's talk about Sparta first. The Code of Lycurgo. I read this part in the prep notes and I genuinely had to double check it. It says they actively allowed theft.
Yes. It's wild. Sparta was, above all else, a military state. Their only goal was to raise tough, cunning, invincible soldiers. So for adolescents, stealing food was actually encouraged by the state. It taught them how to forage, how to be stealthy, how to survive behind enemy lines without a supply chain.
But there was a catch, obviously.
The catch was getting caught. If you stole a loaf of bread and got away with it, good job, you're a good Spartan. But if you were caught, you were punished severely. Not for the moral sin of stealing, but for the unforgivable clumsiness of getting caught.
That is such a deeply Spartan mindset. It's results over morality. Every single time. It's purely utilitarian.
Contrast that completely with Athens. Athens is where we really see the evolution of democracy and modern legal philosophy. And we start there with Draco.
As in the word draconian.
Exactly where the word comes from. Draco wrote the first truly written laws for Athens in the 7th century BC, and they were notoriously severe. Almost every single infraction was punishable by death, stealing a cabbage, death, idleness in the town square, death, murder, death.
Why so harsh, though? Was he just a sadist?
No, actually. He was trying to do exactly what the Lex Talionis did earlier. He was desperately trying to stamp out the blood feuds that were tearing Athens apart. He wanted the state to be the only recognized power. Because if the state promises to execute anyone who steps out of line, nobody else needs to take private revenge. The state does it for you. But crucially, he made a very important distinction. He was the first to really separate crimes against the community from crimes against the individual.
So murdering a citizen isn't just a slight against their family anymore, it's a crime against the community itself.
Yes. But the real massive game changer comes a bit later with Solon, the great reformer. He softened all those harsh, draconian laws, but he did something truly revolutionary in the process. He allowed any citizen to prosecute an offender.
Wait, why is that revolutionary? That sounds completely normal to us today.
You have to think about the past we just discussed. Before Solon, only the specific victim or the victim's immediate family could bring a case to the judges. If you had no family or your family was poor and weak, you got no justice. You were totally helpless. But Solon came in and said, no, a crime against one of us is a crime against all of us. Any citizen in good standing could step into the forum and say, I accuse this man on behalf of the victim.
Oh, wow. That is essentially the birth of the public prosecutor.
Right.
It's the exact moment where the community says, we all have a vital stake in maintaining justice.
It is. It's the pivotal shift from private grievance to public duty.
And philosophically, Padilla notes, this is exactly where we shift away from the idea of spiritual pollution, right, into the idea of civic order.
Right. In the early days, as we saw, punishment was all about purifying the city from the spiritual pollution of a crime, placating the gods. But by the time of Solon and later Athenian democracy, people were starting to openly doubt the gods. Punishment became entirely about maintaining civic order. It became political. The mindset shifted to, we punish you not because Zeus is mad at us, but because we want a safe, functioning city.
But they still didn't have prisons.
Right. No prisons in the modern sense at all. You had the death penalty, enslavement, heavy fines, confiscation of all your property. The source mentions Lacedaemon specifically. Whipping was very commonly used for children and for slaves who couldn't pay fines. But the whole concept of locking someone in a stone box for 10 years as a form of correction, that just didn't exist yet. The ancient world absolutely did not want to pay to feed and house criminals. They wanted to find them, kill them, or banish them beyond the city walls.
Okay, so Greece gets us about halfway there philosophically. But the source makes it clear that the culmination, the absolute final shift to the Western view of law, happens in Rome.
Part 4. The Roman culmination, the political principle.
This is where the divorce finally happens. Law and religion finally break up and go their separate ways.
They do. Rome represents the true birth of public justice, as we would recognize it. In the beginning, Rome had the 12 tables. This was their first big legal monument, carved around the 5th century BC. And right away, they started classifying crimes in a way that looks incredibly familiar to a modern lawyer.
They made the hard distinction between crimina publica and crimina privata.
Exactly. A crimina publica was something like treason or rebellion. It attacked the state directly. A crimina privata was theft or an assault in a tavern. It attacked a private individual.
And what about parricide? Killing your father.
That was considered the ultimate crime in Rome. Parricidium. Originally, it might have just been treated as a common murder, but it quickly became a specific, uniquely horrific category. Because the Roman father, the paterfamilias, was the absolute cornerstone of their entire society. He had power of life and death over his household. To kill him was essentially to kill the mini-king of the family. It was micro-treason.
I remember reading about the specific punishment for this in the text, and it is wild. It wasn't just a standard execution, it was the poinakile.
The penalty of the sack. This is straight out of a nightmare. The convicted murderer was beaten, then sewn up inside a large leather sack along with 4 live animals, a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. And then the whole writhing sack was thrown into the Tiber River to sink.
Talk about a heavy symbolism.
It was incredibly symbolic. It was all about completely erasing the person from the natural order. They were denied the earth because they were enclosed in a leather sack, and they were denied the water because they were drowning inside it without touching it. They were literally obliterated from nature, alongside animals that the Romans considered chaotic or unnatural.
That is deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
But aside from the monkeys and snakes, the source also goes into really good detail about the Roman procedure. How did they actually try these everyday cases?
This is where Rome really shines and influences us today. They invented the questions. These were specialized standing tribunals. Think of them almost like early jury courts that were permanently set up to handle specific types of crime, like political corruption, extortion, or systemic violence. But the thing that really stood out in the text, the thing I know you highlighted in your notes, was the provocatio.
Yes, the provocatio ad populum. Reading about this felt like the absolute climax of the rights of the ancient citizen.
It was the ultimate, undisputed check on state power.
Explain how it worked on the ground.
Imagine you are a Roman citizen in the Republic. A magistrate or a judge has just found you guilty and sentenced you to death. The lictor is standing right there, literally raising his axe to execute you. In that exact fraction of a second, you have a legal superpower. You can look the magistrate dead in the eye and scream, "Provoco," which means I appeal to the people.
And what happens? Does the axe fall?
The execution must stop immediately. By law, the magistrate cannot touch a hair on your head. The entire case is instantly transferred away from the judge and given to the assembly of the people, the comitia, and the citizens of Rome themselves would hear the case and vote on whether you lived or died.
That is just an incredible amount of power to give a regular citizen, to be able to look a powerful judge in the eye and say, "No, you don't decide my fate. I want my peers to decide."
It practically demonstrated that the ultimate final authority in Rome wasn't the king, and it wasn't the consul or the senate. It was the populus Romanus, the people of Rome. It's a beautifully democratic legal concept.
But like all good things in history, it didn't last forever.
No, it didn't. As the Republic crumbled and the empire rose in its place, the state began to consolidate and take over everything. The emperor literally became the state. And slowly but surely, all those private crimes were swallowed up by the imperial bureaucracy. They all became public concerns, and the provocatio simply vanished. You couldn't appeal to the people anymore because the emperor was the only voice that mattered.
So the victim got pushed completely out of the room, and the regular citizen lost his voice.
Exactly. The entire goal of punishment shifted one last time. It was no longer about satisfying the victim, like in the old blood feud, and it wasn't about expiating an angry god like in the temple. It became entirely about defending society, intimidation, making a harsh example of someone so no one else steps out of line.
We have to punish you to keep the emperor's peace.
And honestly, that brings us right to the door of the modern era. The state acts as the ultimate victim now. When you go to criminal court today, the case isn't called Smith versus Jones. It's the people versus Jones, or the state versus Jones. The actual physical victim, the guy who actually got punched in the face, is really just a witness in the state's own grievance against the defendant.
Wow, so let's just take a breath and recap this huge journey we've been on today. We started out in that dusty cave, standing over the dead brother.
The instinct of vengeance. You hurt me, I kill your whole family. Pure, unchecked chaos.
So then we got the lex talionis.
The restraint. You can only take an eye for an eye. It was the very first step toward order, the first mathematical limit placed on human rage.
Then the chiefs and the gods took over.
Divine vengeance. Crime became a sin. We punish the offender to stop the flood and calm the angry deity.
And finally, Rome and the state take the reins.
Political vengeance. We punish solely to maintain civic order, deter crime, and defend the fabric of society.
Looking at it like that, it seems like a very clean, upward line of progress. We modern people love to think we are so much better, so much more evolved than those guys in the cave. But the source, Padilla, throws a pretty big wrench in the gears at the very end of his text.
He really does. He quotes this profound idea that regression has been proved to be as common in history as progress.
That's a deeply scary thought. It implies that this whole evolution isn't a one-way street. We can go backward.
It completely implies that this modern state system we rely on isn't guaranteed at all. Remember earlier we talked about survivals, those little pieces of primitive law that stick around in the background?
Right, the fossils.
Well, think about today. We have this incredibly sophisticated bureaucratic legal system. But what actually happens when the state fails? What happens when there's a disaster and the power goes out? Or when a community feels the courts are fundamentally corrupt, or they know the police just aren't coming?
You see people revert. You see self-help.
You see the ancient blood feud come right back to the surface. You see it in gang warfare. You see it in vigilante justice on the streets. You even see it digitally in internet mobs completely destroying someone's life and reputation because they feel the formal law won't punish them fast enough.
It's like that psychic unity is still sitting right there, just waiting beneath the surface for its chance.
Exactly. The primal instinct for vengeance never actually went away. We didn't evolve out of it at all. We just built a very heavy, very complex structural dam on top of it to keep it contained. But if that dam breaks, the water is still right there.
Man, that is a truly provocative thought to end on. It makes you ask, is our modern legal system actually an evolved state of human being? Or is it really just a very thin layer of ice over a very deep, very cold ocean of primal instinct?
And if that thin ice ever breaks, we're all right back in that dirt field with the dead brother holding a rock.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the history of penal law. It's been a fascinating and honestly slightly terrifying look at exactly where we came from. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to the debate.
It is a pleasure to be here.
Today we are turning our attention to the very foundations of how we punish and why. We're looking at the history of penal law by Lorenzo U. Padilla. And this is a text that really sweeps across the entirety of human experience, from the undocumented shadows of primitive man to the highly rigid codified courts of Rome.
It is a fascinating journey, though I suspect we are going to disagree on the map used to navigate it.
I suspect we might. The central question we are tackling today is one of trajectory. Does the history of penal law represent a uniform, gradual, and, while progressive evolution of the human psyche toward higher forms of justice? Basically, does humanity share a kind of psychic unity that drives us invariably from barbarism to order? I'll be taking the side of the evolutionary perspective, arguing that yes, despite local variations, there is a clear upward trajectory.
Right. And I will be arguing for the nonlinear or critical perspective. The question I pose is whether this evolutionary perspective is just a flawed narrative. A story we tell ourselves to feel civilized, while we ignore the chaotic reality of what the text calls survivals. These ancient, sometimes very brutal habits that just linger in new eras. I'm here to argue that the history of law is a cultural patchwork, not a straight line.
Well, let's get into it. To really understand my position, we have to look at the framework provided by historians like Kohler and Post, which Padilla details in the work. The evolutionary perspective posits that penal law develops in periods and stages. It isn't random. It assumes a general psychic unity of mankind.
You are referring to the idea of parallelism.
Exactly. Parallelism. The idea that whether you are in ancient Babylon or early Europe, the human mind reacts to similar environments by producing similar cultural developments. It moves in imperceptible gradations toward higher forms. The text outlines 4 distinct periods that act as a sort of roadmap: private vengeance, divine vengeance, public vengeance, and finally, the humanitarian period. My argument is that this structure proves that law is a growth. It's an accretion. We clearly move from the absolute chaos of the blood feud to the structured order of the state. And I'd argue that without acknowledging this uniform and progressive framework, modern law really has no context. It just becomes a list of rules without a soul.
I see why you find that framework appealing. It is very tidy. But I have to challenge the very premise of uniformity. As the source material points out, and it references Quilo Calon here, regression has been proved to be as common in history as progress. You speak of these stages as if one neatly ends and another begins, like chapters in a book. But history is much messier than that.
In what way specifically?
Well, the text introduces this crucial concept of survivals, or supervivencias. It uses a really striking analogy, like animals remaining completely unchanged in isolated environments. Old customs persist right alongside new laws. A new period doesn't obliterate the previous one. And honestly, progress is a notoriously subjective term. It implies a judgment of value, that we are somehow better than the ancients, which is a matter of opinion, not historical fact. Furthermore, we have to be very careful about confusing written history with actual history.
That is a fair distinction, but I don't see how it disproves the overall trend.
It undermines the reliability of your stages. The text cites the Spanish partidas and the Especialo de Sajon in Germany. These were erudite, beautiful collections of laws on paper, but they often became dead letters.
Right. They weren't always enforced.
They were never applied in many cases. The living law, what actually happened in the tribunals, was often based on ancient, customary laws that left no written trace. If we only look at the statutes, sure, we see a clean line of progress. But if we look at the reality, we see a chaotic mix of dead laws and surviving customs.
I see why you emphasize that, but let me offer a different perspective. Even if the application was imperfect at times, the intent of the law demonstrates the evolution of the human mind. Let's look at the first major transition, the shift from primitive law, or pure vengeance, to the lex talionis.
The eye for an eye.
Precisely. Now, modern listeners hear eye for an eye, and they immediately think of it as barbaric. But the source material, citing Kirchway, clarifies that the move to the talion was a massive evolutionary leap. In the primitive era, we had blood feuds, sangrientas guerras privadas. If a member of one tribe injured a member of another, there was absolutely no limit to the retaliation. It caused the extermination of entire families.
It was total war, essentially.
It was. And then comes the talion. It sounds harsh to us, but it was a limitation. It essentially said, you may take an eye, but only an eye. You cannot kill the man's whole family. It introduced proportionality. It introduced this concept of similitudo supplici. To me, this proves my point about psychic unity. Humanity, facing the self-destruction of unlimited vengeance, collectively evolved a mechanism to limit violence. That is undeniable progress.
That is a strong point, though I would frame it differently. You call the talion a universal stage of progress, but the historical record shows it wasn't universal at all, which suggests divergence, not unity.
What evidence are you drawing on for that?
Look at the Code of Manu in India, dating back to the 11th century BC. The source explicitly states this code is extraordinarily interesting precisely because it does not employ the talion. It skipped that stage entirely. The Code of Manu was driven by a spirit of justice and religious introspection, derived from Brahma, without ever needing the eye for an eye formula.
But that is one exception in a sea of...
It is a massive exception, and let's look at Assyrian law. If evolution is always progressive, meaning moving toward milder or more rational forms, why was the Assyrian law actually more brutal than the Babylonian law that preceded it? The Code of Hammurabi had the talion, yes, but the Assyrian laws that followed relied heavily on corporal punishment and mutilation and whipping. The text literally calls it the bloody penalty. That looks like a regression to me, or at least a cultural divergence that completely defies your neat linear graph.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because you are focusing on the method of punishment rather than its function. Whether it was the talion in Babylon or, say, the specific compensations in the Hittite Code, which the text notes graduated penalties based on rank, the goal was exactly the same. The goal was to replace the chaotic private vengeance with a system of rules. The caveman had no rules. The ancients did. That is the evolution I'm talking about.
But the caveman is a speculation. As Kirchwein notes in the text, the caveman left no legal records on the walls of his cave. We are projecting our own modern desire for order onto a past we cannot fully know.
We can infer it from what followed, and what followed was the era of divine vengeance. This is the second great stage in the evolutionary model. In the Oriental world, Israel, Egypt, China, law became a transcendental cover.
A cover for what exactly?
For a social control and unification, crime ceased to be just a private wrong between two individuals. It became an offense against God. It required expiation. Look at the Mosaic law in Israel. The right of punishment was framed as a delegation of divine authority, or the Code of Hammurabi, where Hammurabi claimed the god Marduk directed him. This religious unification was, at the time, the only way to bond primitive men into larger communities and actually enforce norms of conduct.
I come at it from a very different angle. You see the divine vengeance period as a unifying step forward. I see it as a period completely rife with contradictions and those pesky survivals I mentioned earlier.
Give me an example from the text.
Let's look at China. The source mentions the Book of Five Penalties. It was religious, yes. The Chinese believed in a universal natural order. But look at what survived inside that sophisticated system: collective responsibility.
You mean punishing the family for the crimes of the individual?
Exactly.
The source notes that in China, this liability extended not only among relatives, but even among officials. This is a clear survival of the primitive blood feud era, where the group is liable for the member, and it's persisting deep into a codified civilization. If the divine stage was a brand new evolutionary step, why did it drag the primitive stage along with it for centuries?
Because evolution is gradual. The text itself says cultural changes move in imperceptible gradations. You can't expect a society to drop thousands of years of habit overnight.
But it creates a fundamental contradiction in your model. Take Israel and the Pentateuch. The text points out there was a massive difference between the codified law and the popular or customary law. For instance, the law requiring the liberation of Jewish slaves after 6 years.
Which is a very humanitarian law for its time.
A law that was written down, yes. But the text explicitly says it was not actually observed at the end of the First Temple. The religio-ethical standards were far in advance of the actual life of the people. So if you judge the era by its books, sure, you see progress. If you judge it by Jeremiah's Lamentations or the actual historical practices, you see that the divine law was often a mask. The law said free the slaves, but the culture said keep them.
That is a fair critique of human nature, certainly. But the very existence of the law, the fact that someone wrote it down as an ideal to strive for, shows the psychic trajectory. And this leads us to what I consider the most significant transition, the shift from the religious to the political, the move toward Greece and Rome.
Right, the rise of the state.
Correct. The text describes the Greek and Roman eras as the triumph of the political principle. In Greece, we really see the transition. Draco's laws began to distinguish between crimes against the community and crimes against the individual. But it is in Rome that we see the full flowering of this.
The crimina publica.
Yes, the crimina publica versus the crimina privata. The state finally assumes the jus puniendi, the exclusive right to punish. It is no longer about appeasing an angry god or a vengeful clan. It becomes about the defense of society. The text notes that in Rome, the differentiation between law and religion was finally achieved. To me, this is the ultimate proof of progress. We move from emotional vengeance to fear of the divine to rational statecraft.
I have to push back there. I just don't buy that the political principle is synonymous with rational progress. Let's look at what the political principle actually meant in practice in Rome. The text says the defense of society became the ultimate and supreme end,
Which allows for social stability.
which allows for tyranny. The state claimed the absolute power of life and death. The text explicitly mentions that the Roman penal law did not reach the high plane to which its civil law was elevated. Why? Because the distinction between public and private crimes left numerous loopholes or lacunas. It allowed for arbitrary discretion by magistrates. The penalties imposed on the humiliores, the lower class, were vastly different and more brutal than those for the honestiores, the upper class. Is that progress, or is it just a more organized, codified form of oppression?
It is organized, and that organization is the key. You are judging the equity of the system by modern standards, but I am arguing for the complexity of the system. The fact that Rome had a radical transformation of procedure, that they established the questiones perpetuas, the permanent tribunals, shows a highly sophisticated mechanism for processing conflict that simply didn't exist before.
But look at the survivals even there. Kirchway asserts that traits of self-help or autoayuda survived long after orderly retaliation was established by the state.
You mean the hue and cry?
The hue and cry in Germanic law, yes, and in Rome, the throwing of offenders from the Tarpeian Rock. That isn't a measured state execution, that is a primitive mob ritual that got codified. And let's go back to Greece for a moment. You claimed it represented a neat transition to the political.
It did. Draco and Solon laid the groundwork.
But the source explicitly says our knowledge of Greek law is incomplete and scattered. We have the laws of Sparta, the laws of Crete, the laws of Athens. There was no single Greek law. In Sparta, theft of food by adolescents was unpunished. In Athens, Solon introduced prosecution by any citizen. It was a complete patchwork. To smooth this all out into a unified political stage ignores the fact that in Greece, family solidarity, which is a primitive trait, was still so strong that a crime could lead to the disenfranchisement not just of the offender but of his children too.
That is an interesting point, though I'd frame it a bit differently. The fact that we can even discuss disenfranchisement means there was a franchise, a citizenship to lose. That concept didn't exist in the primitive blood feud. The individual had finally emerged as a citizen, even if the family ties remained strong. That emergence is exactly the story of evolution I'm talking about.
Or it's just the story of power shifting from the patriarch to the politician.
Well, let's look at the intent of the Greek finds. The text notes that in the Hellenistic period, the end of the penalty was essentially intimidative, not expiatory. They weren't trying to clean the soul anymore. They were trying to stop the behavior through deterrence. That is a modern secular concept.
It is secular, yes. But is it higher? The text mentions that in the Oriental world, the expiation of the penalty redounded to purity. There was a spiritual cleansing involved. When we moved to the political or state model, we lost that completely. We traded purity for intimidation. I am not sure I would call that an ascent of the human psyche.
I see it as a move toward realism, but we are really circling the core disagreement here. You see the exceptions, and I see the rule.
I see the reality on the ground.
The reality is that despite the local variations, despite the fact that India skipped Italian, or that China kept collective responsibility, the macro view is undeniable. We are not living in the caves. We are not conducting blood feuds in the streets today.
No, but the instincts remain.
But they are suppressed by the structure we built over millennia. The text points out that the concepts of talion, composition, which is monetary settlement, and state authority appear across widely separated cultures. This strongly suggests a shared human journey. The psychic unity is real. We all tried to solve the problem of violence, and we all eventually arrived at the state.
We arrived at the state, yes, but that is a compelling argument only if you ignore how much baggage we brought with us. The text concludes that evolution is a useful lens, but it often forces facts into an a priori scheme. It tries to make history tidy, but real history is the history of the survival.
Go on.
The blood feud didn't disappear, it just changed shape. The religious taboo became the sacral crime, and then it became the public crime. We are still dealing with the exact same primitive impulses: vengeance, fear, power. We just built bigger courthouses to contain them. We have to look at the specific cultural context, like the distinctiveness of the Code of Manu or the specifics of cuneiform law, rather than forcing this progressive label on everything we see.
I think we can agree on one thing, however. Whether you view it as a ladder of progress or a cultural patchwork, the study of this history is absolutely essential.
Oh, absolutely.
As the text says, we cannot understand the law of today without harking back over the trail of history. We really need to understand these cultural changes to understand why our laws are the way they are right now.
And to understand that what we write in our codes isn't always what lives in our streets. That is the lasting lesson of the dead letters.
A sobering thought to end on. Thank you for joining the debate.
Thank you.